my review of the Sony a7 Mark II. Now this review comes after several weeks of using this camera, one for a vacation, which allowed me to put it through its kind of travel-friendly paces. I'm going to be running through the pros and cons of this camera, comparing it against a couple others, like the 5D Mark III, which I happen to have along with me on that trip as well, and share my thoughts. But as I often do, I just kind of spoil my reviews up front and tell you that generally I'm very positive about this camera. It is quite nice and a very travel-friendly and general photography-capable camera. But let's get into the spec list first and talk about what it offers. 24 megapixels with an ISO range from 100 to 25,600. You can't artificially extend that down below. You got a 50, a 64, and an 80 ISO as well. 117 phase detection points, 25 contrast detection areas. Not so much points, but more of areas, and those are clustered in the center. In-body image stabilization. Now, maybe I should have led off with this because that is the first real big change that we've come to from the previous model, and in a second we'll look at how this camera just compares to the A7. That in-body image stabilization is 5-axis, which is 2 more axes more than your typical lens stabilization. Usually you have 3, but we've got pitch, roll, yaw, tilt. It's all in there. And I have to say, I found it to be quite useful, especially when you're running around shooting with a nice lightweight prime lens like this 35. Suddenly, it is a stabilized lightweight prime lens. And that worked out quite nicely. And I got some pretty amazingly slow shutter speeds handheld. But maybe I just got lucky. We'll talk about that. 1080p, 60 frames a second. New codec, though, that Sony has started using in many of its cameras. Saw this when I reviewed the A5100. This is the XAVC-S codec. It's going to allow you to get a little bit higher bit rates. Annoyingly, though, it does make you use a faster or larger SD card. Even if you have a very fast 32 gigabyte, you need to use a fast 64. Kind of annoying. It's weather sealed. 350 shots per battery, and we'll talk about my real-world experience with that. And 1.32 pounds, quite light, especially when you make a comparison against something like the 5D Mark III and lens or 2. Now, it is a full-frame sensor, so when you're throwing bigger, nicer lenses on here, you start to lose some of that weight. But wow, for travel, it really is nice to start with such a lightweight body that does provide a full-frame sensor in there. Here's the comparison against the Sony a7, the original model, which is an excellent value and remains a good value still. We'll talk about whether or not it's worth upgrading, or if you're trying to decide which one is best for you, why you might choose one over the other. The first big difference I want to outline in red is that the focusing algorithm has been tweaked in the Mark II. We've got Sony claims, a 30% faster autofocusing system. My real-world testing, I did not carefully test the A7 and the A7 Mark II side by side, but I will say that I have no real complaints about the focusing system of the A7 Mark II. It is perfectly fast enough and capable for general photography, including street photography and travel photography. It's still not what I would call very capable in lower light situations, especially if you're trying to choose your single focus point and you've strayed outside that kind of contrast detection area, because then it does start to struggle, and I would not want to use it for higher speed or action type photography. You're going to be a little unhappy in those situations, but for general photography, absolutely no problems recommending this. Of course, the in-body image stabilization, which I already mentioned, 5-axis. Sony claims up to 4.5 stops slower shutter speeds that you can shoot. I don't know if it's quite that much, but I'll show you an example where I did get really low. That XAVC-S codec I mentioned, greater use of magnesium alloy. The front is now all magnesium alloy as opposed to before it had some kind of composite plasticky stuff. And funny enough, it actually even is supposed to get better battery life despite the fact that it has that in-body image stabilization. 350 shots versus 340. Now, just 10 shots more. I'm not sure that's really worth talking about, but Sony put it out there, so I put it on this list. And now you can see the weight difference between the A7 Mark II, 1.32 pounds, and the original A7, which was just a pound. And I have to say that I was blown away when I first picked up the A7 at how lightweight it was. This was a full frame camera, and some of that kind of newness has worn off as other cameras have come out with just really good image quality, whether or not they're full frame or not, and just very lightweight. But it still is impressively light, but it was almost a little too light, and I didn't love the grip. And so if we move to this next page, we can see a nice side-by-side that they've really redesigned the grip, and I'm very happy carrying this camera around. It is comfortable in the hand. Now, it does feel a little cramped as far as the buttons go, but that is a sacrifice I'm willing to make. There were times on our trip where Christina and I were packing our bag to go out for the day, and she feels similar that I do about this camera. In fact, that it's cramped and the controls aren't perfect, but part of that is our use with the Canon. We're just very used to the Canon. But putting this in your bag and then putting your bag on your shoulder versus putting the little Sony in your bag and putting it on your shoulder is a huge world of difference, and just made us love this camera. And we'll talk about some other options that, you know, are a little bit lighter and almost as good image quality in a minute. So you can see that the grip is much different. The other big redesign is the thumb and finger wheels in the front for controlling your aperture and your shutter speed. I like the redesigned wheels. They're a little bit smaller and a little bit more traditional. Sony on the older models and also on the a6000 uses these kind of nondescript black mystery dials. I'm not sure what exactly my issue is with them, but I prefer these over them. And we've got one more customization button on the top too to give you just a little bit more customization. From the back, the A7 on the left and the Mark II on the right, almost identical. We can see very, very little difference here. One thing that I will say is that the tilt-out LCD on the back is very hard to grab onto. Really, the only place that you can grab to tilt it out is at the bottom, where it's got this little raised nub on either side. So you got to teach yourself motion memory to use that spot, because if you try to grab it at any other spot, it's just a lesson in frustration as you continually drag your finger over the side of it. So is the A7 Mark II worth an upgrade over the original? Or another way to look at it is, if you're trying to decide which of these cameras is right for you, it's about a $400 difference right now, body only. So what are the differences? Let's highlight them again briefly. That 5-axis in-body image stabilization, the better build quality, slightly better build quality, it's really just the front plate difference, the better grip, and the XAVCS codec. Now, for me, that in-body image stabilization and that better grip, this is a really nice camera to hold in the hand. I like to hold it more than I like to hold the original, and it balances more nicely with the kind of bigger, heavier lenses that you might put on this with that Sony sells or the third-party sell. So I would recommend buying this because that in-body image stabilization is a nice feature if you're going to want to walk around and shoot with primes. If you're happy with just the kit lens, which comes with optical stabilization, as Sony calls it, then you may want to just save the money and go for the original A7 and buy yourself one small prime. And it won't be stabilized, but you can certainly still shoot wide open, and you'll be happy. So let's go over the pros as I deem them for this camera. It's very travel friendly. Love that feature that it's just small, lightweight. You throw the 35 on here and you can slip it in just about any bag, and even my raincoat pocket, it will fit inside. The in-body image stabilization and the fact that you can shoot with a fast small prime on here and you have a stabilized system. The autofocusing system was capable. I was never frustrated with it, and when I did get a little frustrated in low light, I changed how I used the focusing system, and we'll talk about that tip in a minute, and got better results. The peaking and the magnification, the fact that you can zoom in when you're manually focusing very nicely, and you also get focus peaking, works well. And I'll tell you another thing about the in-body image stabilization. If you're trying to do macro work, or if you're just trying to carefully focus, having that in-body image stabilization, how many times am I going to say that during this review, allows you to really carefully frame, because the camera is more still and you can see your focus peaking moving across the scene and really nail your focus manually. So there's multiple ways that in-body image stabilization helps. The image quality I found to be fantastic, or excellent, or very good. You know, it's not at the absolute top of its game, but the dynamic range and the higher ISOs are very clean. They're not the cleanest, but they are clean, and I'm very happy with it. And the raw files, as I said, there's a lot of dynamic range in there that you can pull out. Now, I've put a little asterisk there because there's a little hubbub online. The raw files in this Sony are lossy. Sorry, I knew I was going to say it wrong. Lossy. That means that they're compressed just a little bit and some information is thrown out. A true raw file is lossless. No information is thrown out at all. You can decide what you do before you turn it into a JPEG. I tell you, I don't think that it is as big a deal as most people are making it out to be. The quality of these files is very good, and I have to say I had a hard time imagining them being that much better. And it helps keep the file size down a little bit. And the other friendly thing that I really like about this camera is the NFC and Wi-Fi transfer system. It is good and patient. I've run into cameras where you go to transfer, and on my Android phone that sometimes is a little slow or was stuck doing something else, it takes me a minute to get over to the app, and by the time I've done that, the camera is like, well, forget it, I couldn't find anything, I'm going to give up, and goes off to do something else, and then you have to go through the cycle again. Now, it's really easy. You bring up a picture, you hit the little transfer button, or you lay your phone against the side, and it just works. And if your phone is doing something else, it waits patiently until it's ready to go. So that is nice, but it does impact battery life, which brings me to our cons. The first one is battery life. It is horrid, is not too strong a word to use. Now, one of the tips I've received from somebody when I was mentioning this in our weekly podcast was to turn off the pre-AF, which I actually was running into annoyances with the pre-AF on. That is where the camera is helpfully trying to focus on things before you even started to frame your scene or compose your scene. And the annoying thing that I was running into was I would use back button focuses. I think you should most of the time. Got a nice picture, and then maybe I was checking something else out, and then I wanted to take a few more pictures, and it would have, during that time, refocused someplace else because I was pointing at someplace else without me touching any of the buttons. That's annoying, and I think you should turn that off for two reasons. One, it helps your battery life, and two, I think it's a better user experience. The good of the battery life is that it is USB charging capable. So you can grab one of these little RAV Power or USB battery backups and plug it right into here, and when the camera's off, it's charging. So you bring one of these along on your trip or on your walk or your hike, and while the camera's in your bag off, it can be charging up. I do also recommend that you get a spare battery and probably a battery charger. Another con that's not on this list is when you buy the normal kit, it does not come with a battery charger. It only comes with one battery, and you always charge it in camera through the little port on the side. Now, the focus. I found in lower light that using, well, first off, let's go to the first bullet point, setting your focus point. It's a little clunky. It took me a little while to figure out the best customization to do that, but I have now, and I'll share that in the tips section. The other point, I've really pretty much mentioned it already. In lower light, using the single focus point, it can struggle, especially if you get away from the center. And if you switch to one of the zone focus modes or wide and let the camera pick its area, it does a good job most of the time, and that was enough to make me happy, and it did a much better job when you allowed it to have more focus points in lower light. Lens selection, I've got a question mark there because I think for most photographers picking this camera up, the lens selection is fine. We'll come back and share some lenses here in just a minute. But if you're really serious about photography, Sony's FE selection, FE mount selection is pretty limited. And there are third-party lenses and there are more coming, but it still can feel limited for some circumstances. The pay for apps. I might be getting a little too picky here, but when you spend almost $2,000 on a camera, or a little bit under that if you're buying just the body only, I would like all of the functions it's capable of doing be in the camera. Well, I guess I could get grumpy about some of the things on Canon too, but it peeves me a little to go to the App Store and for $10 I can buy an intervalometer or I can buy a Star Trails app. Now, okay, the Star Trails app is pretty specialized and different, but the intervalometer, so many cameras are building that in these days. Why, Sony, just say, hey, free. Put it in there. Are you really going to make that much off of it? I'd like them to do that. You know, I wish this was a touch screen, especially with the focus point, as I mentioned, being a little tricky to set up. It's not a touch screen, and that's not the end of the world, but it certainly could be. And when you look at the menu system that Sony has here, and they've had it now for a while, but as I've used other cameras more recently, like the NX1, I feel like this menu system is just a little too dense, requires so many presses left and right and up to get where you want, that it would be nice as a touchscreen and or a nice menu overhaul to make it easier to go through. And I mentioned this, I'll say it again, when you want to shoot with that higher bit rate, the XAVCS codec, you need a 64 gigabyte or higher card. Even if you have a fast 32 or a faster than your 64 in many cases, it will say, nope, I can't do that. And that's annoying, and that makes me think of some of the other older Sony cameras I use that seem to yell at you lots. This camera doesn't yell at you very much, but that's one instance. And then the video. The moire in this camera is a little bit more pronounced than I think it should be when we're shooting at this level and paying this amount of money. But it's there, and again, I don't think many people are buying this camera for the professional video quality. If you want professional video, you're looking at the Sony a7S or some other camera like even the NX1 or the GH4, but it's certainly capable of shooting nice video. It's just a little prone to moire. I mentioned the lens selection. We've got a shot here of B&H's lists of native FE mount lenses, and as I said, there's a decent selection, but there's certainly nothing that's very cheap like on the Canon or Nikon side, and the selection isn't huge. So that's definitely a con for some of us. But travel-friendly wise, you've got the kit lens, which, let me talk about the kit lens for a second. I don't remember if I actually even put a slide in about this. I've heard a lot of, I haven't heard a lot, I've heard some complaining about the kit lens, and I have to say that after using it for the last couple of weeks, I've been impressed with it. It is a decent lens. Sure, in low light it's not great because it's a variable aperture. You start at 3.5, you go all the way up to 5.6, but the quality of this lens has been very good, and I've been pleasantly surprised by it, and I was quite happy, again, for general travel photography to walk around with this lens and a small prime like the 35. That combination gives you nice convenience and still a friendly, lightweight package that you can do well in low light, or you can just get the shot that you want to shoot. So let's talk for a moment about, the Sony versus a 5D Mark III kit lens. Actually, sorry, that's not the kit lens. It's 24-70 f2.8. The benefits that the 5D Mark III offers are focusing, even in low light, very fast, very capable focusing time and time again. I would not want to head into a wedding reception, the dancing. Sometimes they drop the lights ridiculous amounts, and the 5D Mark III or other DSLR cameras is what I would want in my hands to be able to know that I'm going to get the focus I want on moving subjects in low light. The lenses, of course. Canon offers just a huge array of lenses. Nikon too. Another maybe fair compare, well, we'll get to it in a second. I won't talk about it yet. Battery life. I can walk out the door for a long hike with just 2 bars of battery life and know that I'm fine. Basically, a full day of serious shooting and the battery is going to be just fine. If you are using this camera and you're using the Wi-Fi, you may get a few hours out of it, if that. And you have to be careful. One of the things that I notice, I have the habit with my DSLR of just throwing it in the bag on. It goes to sleep in a minute or two, and that's fine. What can happen sometimes when I throw this in the bag and leave it on is that the eye sensor thinks that I'm putting it up to my eye as it's banging around, and so it turns itself on and off and on and off, and that can very quickly drain the battery. I've noticed I've pulled it out of the bag multiple times that I've forgotten to turn it off, and it's very warm as it's been in there trying to do things. Part of that is me. I need to learn to turn this camera off when I put it in my bag. And speaking of that, the startup time is supposed to be improved over the original as well. It's good, and it's not slow enough that I notice it and am annoyed by it, but it's certainly still not as fast as a DSLR. And the build quality of something like the 5D Mark III, it's really built to be used by a professional and take that kind of day in and day out abuse. The Sony feels good in the hand, feels well made, but I'm not sure that it could take that day in, day out abuse. And it feels like if you drop this, it's a lot more compact and is going to happen. A lot more damage is going to happen to it. I haven't done drop tests, so I can't say for sure, but I think that. The benefits of the Sony, however, a lot cheaper, a lot lighter, huge difference, especially when you start to look at throwing up other lenses. You still got the full frame image quality. Is it better? You know, there's definitely better dynamic range from the Sony sensor. At the higher ISOs, it starts to be a toss-up. The Canon still holds up very well, and if you're comparing this against, well, let's finish. In-body image stabilization is huge. So this gigantic system I have right now, this is the 24-70 f2.8, it's not stabilized. So no image stabilization there, which, depending on what you're photographing, if you want to photograph moving subjects, in-body image stabilization doesn't really help you. But if you're trying to go out for landscape photography and you don't always want to take your tripod with you, then it can be really nice for photographing low-light interiors. That can be very, very helpful. So I've mentioned a couple of times other cameras that maybe we should be comparing this to, like the Nikon D750, which is using those Sony sensors and has very good dynamic range as well. I give a slight edge to the to the Nikon D750 in this case. The Canon 6D is another DSLR we can compare it to, about the same price. Again, the benefits there is you're opening access to a huge array and selection of lenses, third-party, native lenses, and those are built to really last. An awesome battery life. But we've got a lot of mirrorless options as well on the table. We have the Samsung NX1 that I recently reviewed. Fantastic 4K capable camera, beautiful video straight out of that camera. Excellent battery life, really nice Wi-Fi connectivity and that touch screen. Even more of an issue with lenses though, very small native lens selection. Olympus with their OMD EM5 Mark II, which also offers in-body image stabilization, but you're working with a smaller micro four thirds sensor, so not as capable in lower light, but very small, very lightweight, very travel friendly, especially when you start to think about you won't be throwing on big heavy lenses on the Olympus because it's that micro four thirds sensor. So you have an advantage there of walking around with several lenses that are smaller and lighter than the Sony's. And then you have Sony's own a6000, which continues to sell really, really well. It basically looks like this camera, except it's an APS-C size sensor in there. I found that camera to be more capable in tracking focus of moving subjects. So if you're looking for a mirrorless camera and you want to focus, or you want to be able to capture faster action, that is one of the better mirrorless cameras that is out there. So I wanted to share a couple of Mark II tips for the Sony. The battery life, I've mentioned this was passed on to me. Turn off that pre-autofocus. It's in the menu system. You'll have a better battery life, and I think you'll have a better user experience. You can turn airplane mode on as well. Then that takes away some of the fun of this camera. I really like being able to share images on the go. And when you turn that off, you then have to go into the menu, when you turn the airplane mode on, you then have to go into the menu to turn it off to share a picture. So it becomes significantly extra clicks to do that. But if you're going out for a day of shooting and you don't have any plans to share pictures, you're one of those people that just likes to go and photograph and leave the world behind, certainly do that. And also, buy a little USB battery backup and buy at least one spare battery. Third party, the Watson ones are just fine. I think you should also use back button focus, and I'm going to release this as a separate series of tips and show you exactly how to enable back button focus on this. I think you should assign the center point on the control wheel to set your focus point. So that means that you just press down on the center focus point and then you use this directional pad to choose your focus point. I've settled on that being the best way to choose my focus point. In low light, don't use a small focus point, use large, or allow the camera in that kind of zone mode and stick to the center as best you can. And I'm very fond of prime lenses, and this camera, the 35mm f2.8, is, as you can see here, just about perfect in my opinion for general travel and walk around. So I've got a couple bottom lines here. The first is, this is a excellent value, full frame camera. It's got good image quality. Now, it's vacillated between calling it excellent and fantastic. I should step back. I don't think it's fantastic, but it is very good. Now, people who are considering this hear me say it's not fantastic. You know, I have no complaints about the image quality in this camera. I'm happy to leave it on auto ISO and walk around and let it shoot at whatever ISO it wants to, because the images are nice and clean and look beautiful. And I say that in shooting side by side with the 5D Mark III and extremely expensive lenses. It's an excellent travel and general photography camera. I see no reason for someone looking for that type of camera to buy a big old DSLR unless they really want and need access to those specific lenses that are available to Canon and Nikon users that aren't. And then finally, this is my pick out of all of the Sony full-frame cameras. I do think that it is worth the upgrade over the A7, I should say worth the difference in price. If you currently have the A7, I would wait another generation, put your savings into glass. But if you're shopping now, I'd say this is the Sony A7 to get, unless you are a videographer, and then the Sony A7S would be a better pick because of a lot of different reasons, but it's a good bit more money. That's it. If you like this review, take a moment and hit that thumbs up button. That's an easy and free way to thank me for my time. Another easy and free way to thank me for my time and provide you value is hitting the subscribe button. That way you'll be notified of future videos like the Sony A7 tips video and other videos that come out in the future, including reviews, how-tos, and how to do Lightroom post-processing. We've got a whole series. And speaking of that, that's available to my Patreon supporters. Those are people who are choosing to support me monthly and getting in return lots of value for their money. I thank them, and as part of that thanks, they get access to my video library of Lightroom series that is growing weekly, and I'd invite you to check that out right down below at photorec.tv/support. If you got any questions about this camera, leave them right down below. Thanks for watching.